Okay, guys, so today we're going to be getting into chapter 4, and we're going to start looking at policing here, and we're going to go a little bit into the aspect of history of policing, but we're also going to talk about some of the policing agencies that are out there and kind of what police do. So let's start looking first at what police actually do. There are three basic reasons that we have police. Number one, we have police to actually enforce laws. We have police so that we can, number two, go out and arrest offenders. But we also have police so that we can actually prevent crime. And crime prevention is probably one of the hardest things for police to do. And we'll talk about some of the studies that have been done on crime prevention a little bit later. There are tons of policing agencies. As a matter of fact, if you go on Google and you look, you'll find that there are federal policing agencies, there are state policing agencies, the FBI, the SBI. All of those are pretty well known, but most cases when we talk about law enforcement, we really think more about our local police departments, such as our sheriff's office and our city police. But there are a myriad of agencies out there at the state and local and federal level that have some type of policing enforcement responsibilities. The one thing that I really want to hit on in this chapter, though, is looking a little bit at what we call the policing styles. And this goes into the history of policing a little bit. Now, some of you may remember from earlier courses or from earlier in this course that our style of policing, going into the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, we started copying the London Metropolitan Police Department and the Peel model of policing, which, if you'll remember, is very community-oriented. Robert Peel believed in having bobbies that were out there walking the streets, talking to people, knowing the community. And so we started to actually emulate that type of policing style here in the United States. The first style that I'm going to mention is what's called the Watchman style. And in America, this went, we argue, from about the 1860s, 1870s up until the 1930s. And while much of it was based on the Peelian model, the problem we had with it here in America was that it was very corrupt. We had cities such as Chicago, New York, and Boston that were known for their corruption when it comes to policing. As a matter of fact, we had cases in New York City where police officers were taking bribes from local brothels and houses such as that and were paying off politicians. New York City was probably one of the worst in that they actually had a price list where if you wanted to be a police officer, you had to pay your local politician X number of dollars. If you wanted a promotion, you had to pay more money into it. And so we had these real issues with corruption. As a matter of fact, one of the more popular commissions at the time period said that to get rid of all the corruption in New York City and Chicago, we literally need to fire everybody and start again. And so what started happening here was the public started catching on to the amount of corruption that was going on. As a matter of fact, if you go in and look, one of the most popular pictures of the time is Al Capone walking out of a Chicago police department smiling because he knew he would not be arrested, and he never was. He was basically responsible for murders, many murders, and was never charged with any of them. They got him for tax evasion. And so what happened here was we started seeing this movement in the 1930s where the belief for some was that the community was the influence here. The community was a negative influence. And so many academians and police officers wanted to start moving away from the community. They felt that isolation was going to be key here. But there are a couple other things that happened in the 30s and 40s that really changed law enforcement. Number one, we had World War II that happened in the early 40s, and so we had a lot of guys that were returning home from war that had this very militaristic structure. And so what we see happening, those guys go into law enforcement and they start changing how police officers operate. We also had technological innovations. We had the vehicle come about. Now we don't have to have police officers walking a beat. We can put them in a car. They become more mobile. We have the radio. We have all these technological innovations that start separating the community from the police department. We also have chiefs that start coming in and wanting to see more educated officers. So education starts to becoming a little bit more prevalent, but that doesn't happen really until the 60s and 70s. But it's these innovations which start changing police officers. And what we have happen here is we have these very rigid, militaristic guys that come out and they're going into these neighborhoods and they're enforcing the law and they're enforcing the letter of the law, and we start having a lot of social unrest. This is the time period, especially in the 60s, of the Watts riots, of things going on over in California on college campuses. And what we see here is kind of a social class clash, to where people in lower incomes often feel that they're being policed by this governmental agency. They're sending in these lily white police officers into these urban areas that don't understand the problems, and we have this huge explosion of frustration that occurs. And so the 60s and 70s were really the pinnacle of the legalistic era and showed its faults a lot. That we were really trying to more or less take over these areas, and we weren't doing a very good job of policing them. They saw it more as occupation than policing. Which started in the late 1970s, we had this concept come about of what we call a service style. And the question was this: how do we go in to these communities and build better relationships with them? And this is where community policing actually gets its start. And what police departments during this time period start to realize is that community relationships are what's going to help us move into the 2000s and later on in policing history. Community policing, and I want you to understand this, is a philosophy. It is a mindset. It is not a single program, but it is a mindset on how do we best build relationships with departments and with the communities. The programs that we institute, like foot patrols and community policing patrols and neighborhood watches, are a portion, a small portion of how we actually carry out that relationship. But understand, it's a philosophy, it's a mindset of wanting to be out there building good community relations. That's what community policing comes down to. And in with this idea of community policing, we have to look at, how do we know how to best police communities? How do we do this? And so what we started having were what we call evidence-based policing. And one of the biggest studies that was done was what we call the Kansas City experiment. And the Kansas City experiment was, of course, done in the city of Kansas. And we start looking at, how do we best patrol? The Kansas City experiment was one of the first experiments that allowed us to go into a police department, make changes to their patrol methods, and actually come out with good research on it. Here's what happened. Kansas City was divided into 3 areas. One area received a normal amount of patrols. The second area received double the patrols. The third area received no patrols. In the third area, the police could only go into those areas to answer calls and then had to leave immediately. The results of that were very interesting. What basically boiled down to was the area that received no patrols, citizens didn't even notice. The citizens didn't even notice. And so that started making us think, does the amount of patrols we actually have in an area reduce crime? Now, there have been multiple studies that have come out after this that refute Kansas City experiment and some that support it. But there's also a good research out there on what we call hotspots, and we're going to look at those in this chapter. That maybe patrolling large neighborhoods isn't the answer, but maybe looking at specific areas, a specific address. And that's what a hotspot is. The research comes down to that even in a neighborhood, a bad neighborhood, there's typically 1 or 2 addresses or locations in that bad neighborhood that receive a majority of the calls. So maybe it's not the neighborhood that needs to be patrolled, but the one location that needs to be patrolled. And that's essentially what a hotspot boils down to. Then we have what we call problem-oriented policing. Problem-oriented policing is very similar to community policing. Again, this was a program that came out in the 80s. What are the problems that the community has? How do we help solve problems that lead to crime? Broken windows theory can fall into this, broken street lights. How are we going to be able to bond with the community to solve particular problems that are creating issues and crimes in the community themselves? Those are just a few things we're going to be looking at during this chapter. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.